Hello everyone, today we read and comment the first paragraph of the first chapter of the sixth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. We start in fact the sixth book today. It's titled being Defense, chapter first is titled instead Offense and Defense, and the first paragraph is on the conception of defense. It's fairly short. The text follows. What is defense in conception? The warding off a blow. What is then its characteristic sign? The state of expectancy or of waiting for this blow. This is the sign by which we always recognize an act as of a defensive character, and by this sign alone can the defensive be distinguished from the offensive in war. But inasmuch as an absolute defense completely contradicts the idea of war, because there would then be war carried on by one side only, it follows that defense in war can only be relative, and above distinguishing signs must therefore only be applied to the essential idea or general conception. It does not apply to all the separate acts which compose the war. A partial combat is defensive if we receive the onset, the charge of the enemy. A battle is so if we receive the attack, that is, wait for the appearance of the enemy before our position and within range of our fire. A campaign is defensive if we wait for the entry of the enemy into our theater of war. In all these cases, the sign of waiting for and warding off belongs to the general conception, without any contradiction arising with the conception of war, for it may be to our advantage to wait for the charge against our bayonets or the attack on our position or our theater of war. But as we must return the enemy's blows if we are really to carry on war on our side, therefore this offensive act in defensive war takes place more or less under the general title defensive, that is to say, the offensive of which we make use falls under the conception of position or theater of war. We can, therefore, in a defensive campaign fight offensively. In a defensive battle we may use some divisions for offensive purposes, and lastly, while remaining in position awaiting the enemy's onslaught, we still make use of the offensive by sending at the same time balls into the enemy's ranks. The defensive form in war is therefore no mere shield, but a shield formed of blows delivered with skill. So this is an interesting look at the concept of defense, which is pretty simple in itself, and von Clausewitz fundamentally is stressing how, of course, offense and defense are two specific and, in a sense, unchangeable conceptions, right? But that in war there can't be fundamentally an exclusive defense or offense. There's always both at the same time, practically, right? Not even just defense in the function of mere passive reception, but as we've seen here, in a sense of warding off a blow, which can happen, obviously, with at least a counteroffensive element, or simply, for the sake of clarity, to simply an offense during the defense, as von Clausewitz has just exemplified. That is to say, there is a general, right? These offense and defense are always there at the same time, just in different measures, right? And they're always there, right? They never come to zero, right? And they're always present, actually, in substantial degree. So, simply reading here, conception and defense. What is defense in conception? Because here we're making a theory of the art of war, so we have to clarify what it is in practice, aside from what, you can't couple it like with offense. So defense in conception is the warding of a blow, right? This is the point. It's not merely it's not a passive take. It's properly trying to ward it off, which is instinctive. You're fundamentally protecting yourself more than passively receiving something. You're fighting, in a way or not. And von Clausewitz says, what is then its characteristic sign? So its characteristic sign is the state of expectancy, or of waiting for this blow, so that you and this is interesting because it takes on a psychological character. You know that is gonna happen. This is not merely defending in the moment in which this is taking place. Remember, in a way, the suspension of the act of war that we have seen in the previous books. Well, this is properly the point. War cannot be, by definition, either a constant state of offense or defense in a combat situation. Right? You have to stop at a point. And even during combat, there is properly a moment in which you stay there just doing nothing. So, since moral forces, as we have countlessly repeated, are the most important relevant factor in war, of course, defense as well as offense, as we will see, are, something that you, if you want, projectually find yourself in from a mental point of view. That is, when you have to defend, you don't just happen to defend randomly because, there's a blow arriving from nowhere at one point, but because you have been preparing for it, and you have already decided to be on the defense, right? So you are practically, in fact, waiting for this blow to happen and preparing accordingly. So von Clausewitz says this is the sign by which we always recognize an act as of a defensive character, and by this sign alone can the defensive be distinguished from the offensive in war. And it is important as a discriminant, because the example I just made about the a blow arriving out of the blue doesn't quite take into consideration, and it's somewhat misleading as an idea of defense. Why? Because it doesn't take into consideration what you are prepared to do. Because while you're being hit, you may be actually set on an offensive mindset. So here it's literally the state of expectancy that makes the defense. It's the fact that you are expecting from that blow to arrive and preparing to ward it off. This is the sign alone that distinguishes the defensive from the offensive in war. This is fundamentally important because at a conceptual level, that's exactly what is going to happen. And as we will see in offense, that's practically, in fact, the same thing. I mean, you may be attacked, as we were saying before, unexpectedly, while you are basically offending, right? And the fact that you haven't prepared for that blow is what makes the difference, but doesn't, in fact, make you a defendant at that point. It's only when you realize you've been attacked in a way you weren't foreseeing, and that chances are it's better for you. You basically decide to be on the defensive at that point, to keep receiving and warding off the blow. Then you pass on the defensive, and naturally this takes on also a relative value, because that can still happen in a broader defense, in a broader offensive situation, because you may have to get rid of that problem at that moment. It may be minor, but nevertheless important for you individually, but on a broader scale you may be part of an offensive at that point. So yes, you're defending, but still the main goal is defense, and you're set on those two different scales on both, right? And that's what makes the difference, because the way you defend at that point may still have to take into consideration what you will have to do next if you emerge victorious from that, because you may lose in that encounter, in that fight, what, for example, is necessary for you to go on with the offense. It's pretty obvious, right? If you emerge as badly wounded, you can't achieve eventually what you had scheduled before. You will change your plans, and therefore also your mindset relatively to the offense or defense or whatever, respectively to your objective. And then von Clausewitz writes, but inasmuch as an absolute defense completely contradicts the idea of war, because there would be then war carried on by one side only, it follows that the defense in war can only be relative, and the above distinguishing sign must therefore only be applied to the essential idea or general conception. That is what we have said both at the beginning and fundamentally also implicitly with these last examples, right? Because there can't be like a side that is just merely waiting for the blow to arrive, right? There is always the intention to carry on that fight in a way or another to strike the final blow, right? Because it's fundamentally, I mean, of course here it's complex, because if we look at the idea of a duel, that you can't technically even wait for your foe to to exhaust himself. This can happen on a larger scale as well. But the point is that there is an economy in war for which, of course, when the enemy is exhausted, you can inflict the final blow, and that will make actually a much greater difference in the outcome, because that is going to determine much about what is going to happen also after the war. That is, how you've won, how much you've won, what is the the point you have inflicted to the enemy, a crushing defeat or not. Because even if let's suppose ideally that you just stay there passively and the enemy exhausts himself without knocking you down, right? It's a bit realistic, but let's assume it. Well, if he's not if you don't give the final blow, if you have the chance, right? So passing to the counter-offensive, and therefore to an offensive mindset, not merely an absolute defensive one, the guy may leave on to fight another day, right? Or at least simply, without entailing now the death or the killing, but specifically, which in practice in warfare is on a larger scale. What for in a duel, maybe just a little poke could be, 100 people killed in a war, right? At that point, if you smash the guy, the chances for that guy to say, okay, next time we will do it, maybe better, and it will defeat this person, will dramatically shrink, right? Because not only you have been passive there, but you have striking back. And if you look at how war is practically fought, there is never like a passive defense, an absolute defense for which you're just waiting for this blow or simply parrying it, right? That means to leave the initiative to the enemy, which is an extremely dangerous thing. It's one of the worst things in war in absolute terms. So you are always there, not just to defend, but to pass on the offensive at the end of the day. And this fits with the broader philosophy of war that von Clausewitz stresses, that war, of course, has to be a fight in an active sense. That is, those who fight have always something to win, to pass fundamentally more on the offensive than to the defensive in the end. This is how wars are practically fought for real, right? And also in there, as we've seen on the consequences of victory and the outcome and the effect, especially in moral forces, how you inflict a defeat to the enemy is going to have enormous resonance, right? Even in different ways, because the dimension in which that propagates and echoes is not war anymore. So it also has other laws. It can even falsify the actual reality, right? There can be even maybe a small loss at that point that can, have a devastating blow. But on average, the greater the blow you inflict, and exponentially greater the moral effect is. And since we have seen that war is basically is on a dual and large scale, yes, and has as its own objective to compel your enemy to fulfill your will, that is mostly a moral situation. I mean, killing is just mostly part of the proceeding. What you want in war, practically, is convincing the enemy to do what you want, right? To come to your terms of the story. So that is the objective of a war, and therefore it cannot entail an absolute defense. You have to pass to counterattack. You have to be there just to put the guy down at the end. Because the hardest you do that, the greater the fruits of victory are going to be. And that's what you have been fighting for at the end of the day. Of course, there are situations in which politically speaking, and that's the other part of the other dimension we were talking about before, you may not even have an interest to retaliate or whatever, but the concept is still that these are meaningful things usually happening. That is, even even the possibility of a threat is, generally speaking, something negative that that in politically, socially, we take at the point of ensuring that certain things not to happen anymore. So it's very important the way you strike back, right? So, and von Clausewitz here is highlighting naturally the overlapping of defense and offense, always. Von Clausewitz says, a partial combat is defensive if we receive the onset, the charge of the enemy. A battle is so if we receive the attack, that is, wait for the appearance of the enemy before our position and within range of our fire. A campaign is defensive if we wait for the entry of the enemy into our theater of war. And as we will see, and we have partially already seen, that point you are actually gaining strength that you are going to use for a counterattack, right? Because the enemy usually, and as we've seen in real war, on average, has pretty good chances to win the war after all, right? Even if the odds are risky, but the approach to something like 50-50, right? So it's very easy to, if you have come to, to resolve this dispute violently, that, there are good reasons to think that you're risking something important too. So actually, that's why normally wars are about this, that a merely passive attitude with no action will bring to your defeat, and it doesn't make any sense. And also, as we were saying, that of course this can be a broader strategy. We've seen that for von Clausewitz, defense is actually the strongest form of war, but with negative purpose, and this paragraph basically also clarifies why. Because of course, he who attacks is losing strength along the way. Also, defendant is doing in a sense, because he's up there in arms and it costs, but still, in strategical, tactical terms, this is going to be felt, so that usually one's a defensive position has chosen it carefully, even for a counter-strike. Otherwise, and that's why normally battles that are fought between two people that attack at the same time are actually less bloody, paradoxically, than those that are fought against somebody who is attacking and another who is defending. Because in the latter case, the bloodshed will be much more rapid, much more accelerated. It will boom fundamentally. There will be much more forces crushing one against the other, and much greater annihilation, while those who are attacking are always looking at more carefully at what they're doing, because they have the positive aim there. They're doing something. They have the initiative, yes, but also they're from the weak side of the weak form of war, because they are fundamentally spending themselves in order to carry that out. So we're always talking on average in the theory of the art of war. Of course, there are situations in which this balance is inverted, but that's fundamentally what war is about, is determining that. But there is the intrinsic balance, however, always responding to the same dynamic. So von Clausewitz says, in all these cases, that is, of waiting, right, the sign of waiting for and warding off belongs to the general conception, without any contradiction arising with the conception of war, for it may be to our advantage to wait for the charge against our bayonets, or the attack on our position or our theater of war. But, as we must return the enemy's blows, if we are really to carry on war on our side, therefore this offensive act in defensive war takes place more or less under the general title of defensive, that is to say, the offensive of which we make use falls under the conception of position or theater of war. We can therefore in a defensive campaign fight offensively. In a defensive battle we may use some divisions for offensive purposes, and lastly, while remaining in position awaiting the enemy's onslaught, we still make use of the offensive by sending at the same time balls into the enemy's ranks. The defensive form in war is therefore no mere shield, but a shield formed of blows delivered with skill. Right? So in here, it's expressed properly the mixed nature of this war that can be generally defensive, but still is fought in ways that are normally predisposed for counteroffensive, and an offensive in general as a mean of, not just parrying. In fact, by that's the distinction, parry warding off a blow, but to deliver one to the enemy. So this broader defensive outlook is taken but by receiving an enemy attack with that intention, as we've seen, but still parrying it, right? With what? With an offensive mean, right? So this is beautiful definition. No mere the defensive form in war is therefore no mere shield, but a shield formed of blows delivered with skill, right? And this thing of blows delivered with skill is crucial too, because the defense has, as we've seen, that intrinsic advantage that is, you're there, the enemy is spending himself to attack you while you're coldly, hopefully for you there, calculating what you can do with much more ease, and therefore you can use that skill to your own advantage. And this is what normally happens. I mean, this is valid for the whole Vom Kriege. All we're reading here is not much of an option, right? The Vom Kriege is of course conceived to give you, let's say a practical, effective advice about what to do. Yes, but how war is fought historically is always like this. That is to say, you don't have somebody who goes out there fighting a war, doesn't practically know that this is happening, because you're always going to defend to expect. I mean, when you're defending, you're doing it for a reason. You're in that condition of expectancy, and you're sitting there not to receive passively a blow, but to ward that off, because that's what we instinctively do, even if we know nothing about war, right? So altogether, everybody behaves like this, and organized fights, let's say a war proper, has always functioned like this, and therefore there is no exception to it. This is not a matter of speculation. This is simply understanding the dynamics of how this happens and why, and to conceive a little bit better and clearly what we mean, in fact, by offense and defense. And I think the initial distinction, the state of expectancy as the characteristic sign of defense, is crucial in here, because I presume any person would be asked, but what is defense to you? Well, it's mostly, shielding yourself. Yes, but how, right? And at that point would emerge the realization that you're not simply passively taking something, but you're always you're there to counterstrike and to think at least that you would defend yourself were you to receive the blow. So what makes the difference there is not how, the fact that whether you strike back or not, but whether you're expecting the first blow or not, right? And then naturally there can be a more or less passive reception of certain attacks, right? It's obvious that not all attacks are repelled with the same energy, etc. So that has a lot to do with how the operations are handled and etc. But concretely, this overlapping of offense and defense are always there. So next time we'll see the advantages of the defensive more in detail. For now, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.